When a perceptive teacher notices the haunted look in a young girl's eyes, the first words the student whispers send chills down her spine. What seemed like ordinary childhood troubles at first takes a sinister turn as hidden pieces come together, revealing a dark truth, one that puts her life and her future in unimaginable danger. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. The sky over Maplewood Middle School seemed permanently gray that spring morning, thick clouds drifting sluggishly across a sun that struggled to cast its warmth. 12-year-old Katie walked along the edges of the corridor, body held tense as she kept her eyes downcast. Students bustled around her, chattering, laughing, pushing through lockers. But Katie's small frame and withdrawn manner let her slip past them like a ghost. If anyone did notice her, they only saw the stiff set to her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the straps of her backpack as though it might fly off if she loosened her hold. At a glance, Katie appeared to be a normal 7th grader, average height, hair worn in a ponytail that swayed each time she moved. Yet there was a flicker of fear in her gaze, as if she were bracing for impact at any moment. Most of the teachers were busy preparing for the day's lessons, glancing at the flow of arriving students without too much concern, except for Miss Hamilton. Miss Hamilton, an English teacher in her early 30s, had the sort of keen, empathetic presence that made her students feel seen. She was neither too strict nor too lenient, known for a ready smile but also for a perceptive eye. Standing beside her classroom door, greeting students with a nod and a "good morning," she paused when she spotted Katie. The girl's anxious silhouette caught Miss Hamilton's attention like a magnet. There was a subdued panic in Katie's posture that refused to be hidden by the usual chaos of first-period arrivals. "Katie," Miss Hamilton said gently, stepping forward and blocking the girl's path into the classroom. "Are you all right? You look a little shaken." Katie almost jumped at the sound of her name. She forced a small smile, a ghostly imitation of warmth, and mumbled, "I'm okay. Just tired." Miss Hamilton wanted to press for more information, but the hall was still full of children, and the bell's echo was imminent. "All right," Miss Hamilton said, letting her voice convey gentle concern. "But stop by after class if you have a moment, okay?" Katie nodded, eyes lowered. She slipped past and went to her desk. Miss Hamilton watched her go, a sense of unease tightening the pit of her stomach. She had seen students burdened with secrets before. She knew the signs. Yet she had no evidence of anything specifically wrong. No bruises, no clearly expressed fear. Just the intangible aura of a child carrying a weight too heavy for her age. Classes began, and the day wore on with the usual shuffle of textbooks and scratch of pencils. Katie sat at her desk, seldom raising her hand or looking up. When Miss Hamilton posed a question about the assigned reading, Katie startled as if awakened from a bad dream, then quickly shook her head. "I don't know," she whispered. Her face flickered with guilt, as though she were disappointing Miss Hamilton by not answering. During lunch, Miss Hamilton hoped Katie might come by, but the girl was nowhere to be found. Concern grew sharper in Miss Hamilton's mind. With so many students to watch over, it was easy to miss the quiet ones who never made trouble, yet often they were the ones who needed help the most. The final bell rang, releasing the school into a swirl of chatter and excitement. Ms. Hamilton lingered by her desk, grading papers, hoping Katie might still show up. About 20 minutes after the other students had cleared out, she caught sight of a slim form hovering in the doorway. It was Katie, backpack hugged tight against her chest. "You asked me to come," Katie said in a small voice. Miss Hamilton set aside her pen. "Yes, I did. Come in, have a seat." Katie took a few tentative steps, then perched on the edge of a chair as though poised for flight. She stared at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "I just wanted to check on you," Miss Hamilton said. "You seem to be troubled lately. Is everything all right at home? Or here at school?" Katie's eyes darted up, panic flashing across her face. "I'm fine," she repeated, but this time it sounded hollow. I haven't been sleeping well. Miss Hamilton studied Katie's features, the pale cheeks, the faint tremor in her fingers. If there's something you want to share, something that's bothering you, you can trust me. I'll do my best to help. For a moment, Katie opened her mouth, words trembling on the tip of her tongue. Miss Hamilton saw the turmoil in the girl's gaze, as though Katie longed to unburden herself but was chained by fear. Finally, Katie just shook her head again. "Thank you, Miss Hamilton," she whispered, eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. "But really I'm okay." Miss Hamilton exhaled quietly. She didn't want to push too hard and risk scaring Katie away. "All right," she said gently. "But my door is always open." Katie nodded, stood up, and slipped out of the classroom with a muttered goodbye. Miss Hamilton watched her go, convinced more than ever that something sinister was lurking behind Katie's guarded silence. That night, Miss Hamilton found it difficult to sleep. She kept picturing Katie's haunted eyes, the tension in the girl's posture. She had no proof that Katie was in any danger, but her instincts screamed otherwise. "I'll keep an eye on her," Miss Hamilton vowed, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment. "If something is wrong, I'll find a way to help." Morning arrived, bringing a steady drizzle that turned the sidewalks slick and the sky a uniform gray. Katie came to school with damp hair, wearing a thin jacket that didn't look warm enough for the chilly weather. Miss Hamilton noticed her shivering in homeroom. She considered offering a sweater from the lost and found, but the idea of embarrassing Katie in front of others held her back. Instead, she waited until lunchtime, hoping to catch Katie alone again. Unfortunately, Katie vanished the moment the lunch bell rang. Miss Hamilton frowned, deciding to roam the halls in search of the girl. After checking the cafeteria and library without success, she finally found Katie outside near a side door, curled up on a bench with her backpack clutched to her chest. The drizzle had stopped, but the air remained cold and damp. "Katie," Miss Hamilton said, approaching quietly. Katie looked up, startled. "Oh, hi," she murmured, eyes flitting away. Miss Hamilton sat beside her. "You're missing lunch. Aren't you hungry?" Katie shrugged, expression guarded. "I'm okay." Miss Hamilton folded her hands in her lap. For a few seconds, neither spoke, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Then Miss Hamilton decided to try a gentler tactic. "You know, I used to hide out during lunch when I was in middle school," she offered in a confessional tone. "Some days, everything felt too overwhelming. I just needed a corner to breathe." Katie glanced at her, curiosity flickering in her gaze. "You did?" Ms. Hamilton nodded. "Middle school can be tough. But I also know that sometimes, what's bothering us isn't just about school. It can be something at home, or something we're scared to talk about." A tear slid down Katie's cheek before she hastily wiped it away. "You can't say," she whispered. "I'm sorry." Miss Hamilton's heart clenched. She lifted a hand, placing it gently on Katie's shoulder. "You don't have to be sorry. But if you ever decide you want to talk, even if it's not about everything, just a little bit, I'm here." Katie nodded, lips pressed tight to hold back a sob. Footsteps echoed from within the hallway, and the moment fractured. Miss Hamilton patted Katie's shoulder once more, then rose to her feet. "Let's get inside before the next bell," she said quietly. Katie stood as well, shoving her hands in her pockets, head bowed. They walked back in silence, Miss Hamilton's mind racing with unanswered questions. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Fleeting exchanges, Katie's perpetual unease, Miss Hamilton's mounting worry. Nothing definitive, but an unmistakable sense of a looming storm. That's when Miss Hamilton decided to confide in the school counselor, Mrs. Anderson. Mrs. Anderson was a steady presence at Maplewood Middle School, known for her calm approach and patient listening. Her office was a small, warm space adorned with motivational posters, potted plants, and a couch that often hosted students wrestling with anxiety or emotional turmoil. Ms. Hamilton entered one afternoon after her last class, heart pounding with the urgency of her suspicions. Mrs. Anderson, Miss Hamilton began, perching on the edge of the chair opposite the desk, I need your insight. It's about Katie Reynolds, one of my 7th graders. Mrs. Anderson tilted her head, giving Miss Hamilton her full attention. Of course, tell me what's going on. Miss Hamilton described Katie's withdrawal, her anxious demeanor, the near-tearful confessions that never quite emerged. She confessed her fear that Katie might be hiding something severe, though she had no idea what. I suspect it could be something at home, Miss Hamilton said. But Katie won't talk. I don't see any visible signs of abuse, but her behavior is just, it's like she's always looking over her shoulder, waiting for disaster. Mrs. Anderson nodded thoughtfully. I've seen her around. She's polite but very quiet. I spoke to her at the start of the school year, just a routine check-in, nothing stood out at the time. She tapped a pencil against her notepad. You said you think something might be happening at home. Do you know anything about her foster parents? Foster parents? Ms. Hamilton echoed as though tasting the words for the first time. Martin and Rebecca Reynolds, right? They came to the last parent-teacher conference. Seemed pleasant enough. Polite, engaged, asked about Katie's progress. But you know how that can go. Some people are experts at playing the role. Mrs. Anderson's face grew pensive. Yes, indeed. Katie's file says she's been in their care for almost 2 years now. No official complaints have been filed, and from a surface glance, the Reynolds appear to be good guardians. Ms. Hamilton swallowed her frustration. Then why does Katie look like she's on the edge of a precipice every day? Mrs. Anderson sighed. If she's being psychologically manipulated or forced into something, it might not leave obvious signs like physical abuse. We'll have to dig deeper. Let me try calling her in for a counseling session. Tell her it's a routine check. Maybe she'll open up if she thinks it's confidential. Gratitude welled in Miss Hamilton. Thank you. I just have a bad feeling about this. I'd hate for something to slip through the cracks if she's in real danger. Mrs. Anderson assured Miss Hamilton she'd do everything in her power. The teacher left the office feeling a shred of hope. Maybe together, they could break through Katie's silence. That hope wavered later that week when Miss Hamilton spotted Katie near the school side entrance, clearly waiting for a ride. Martin Reynolds pulled up in a sleek black sedan, rolling down the window to wave Katie over. His smile was bright, almost dazzling, the kind that would make neighbors say, "What a friendly man." Miss Hamilton hovered by the door, eyes narrowing as she watched Katie climb in. Before Katie shut the car door, Miss Hamilton caught sight of Martin leaning across the passenger seat, speaking in hushed, insistent tones. Katie's face paled, and she nodded rapidly as though affirming something. Then the door closed and the car drove off. The brief exchange left Miss Hamilton with goosebumps prickling her arms. It felt so orchestrated. She had to remind herself that there was no proof, no reason to suspect a crime from a simple conversation. Yet her instincts refused to quiet. That evening, the image replayed in Miss Hamilton's mind. She tried to picture Martin and Rebecca's daily life. A neat suburban home, dinners together, maybe the occasional board game on weekends, the kind of environment a child might call stable. But the anxiety etched on Katie's face told another story. Miss Hamilton couldn't let it go. Meanwhile, in a small, tidy house on Birch Street, Katie sat in her dimly lit bedroom, tears burning at the corners of her eyes as she stared at the worn carpet. Downstairs, her foster parents were talking in hushed, intense voices. She caught snippets like, "Tonight, no mistakes," and "Keep the girl in line." Her heart pounded. She knew exactly what they were planning. Martin and Rebecca had gradually introduced her to small tasks, as they called them, over the last year. What started as picking up a forgotten wallet or delivering an envelope at a neighbor's house had escalated into rummaging through lockers at school, retrieving items from unsuspecting teachers' desks, and even sneaking into restricted rooms. Martin would occasionally look at Katie with an unnerving smile and say, "You're a smart kid. No one suspects you." She hated it. The guilt ate at her. Yet every time she mustered the courage to say no, Martin's voice turned menacing. Do you know how quickly we could send you back to the system? Or how fast everything could go bad for you if you don't cooperate? We're the only family you've got. Rebecca was no gentler. She'd fix Katie with a cold glare, reminding her of the times they'd provided food, shelter, and new clothes, all to underscore the debt Katie owed. We took you in when nobody else would, Rebecca once hissed, pointing a manicured finger at Katie's trembling figure. Don't forget that. Now do what you're told. That night, Katie knew she was supposed to sneak into the school's main office early the next morning. The plan was to slip an unmarked envelope into a locked cabinet, likely containing forged paperwork or stolen data, though Katie never knew exactly what. She shuddered at the thought, wishing desperately she could confide in Miss Hamilton. The teacher's kind eyes and gentle questions had stirred something in Katie's chest, a longing to be saved. But fear kept her locked in place. If she told Miss Hamilton about Martin and Rebecca, they might punish her in ways she barely dared to imagine. Sleep offered no respite. She tossed and turned, dreaming of faceless figures chasing her through endless school corridors. Morning arrived too soon, and she found herself creeping through the chilly hallways before class, the envelope stuffed in her backpack. She glanced around at the deserted corridor, heart hammering as she approached the main office door. She had gleaned from Martin how to pick simple locks, a skill that made her feel sick with guilt. It was shockingly easy, twisting a small tool until the latch clicked. Inside, the morning light filtered through tall windows, illuminating the row of filing cabinets. She located the one Martin had described, second from the left, bottom drawer. Her hands shook as she pulled it open, slid the envelope inside a plain manila folder, and then closed it. She prayed no one would come in. She prayed Miss Hamilton wouldn't see her. The sound of footsteps made her freeze, but they passed by the hall and never entered. Katie scurried out, locking up behind her, tears threatening to fall. She had done it again, committed another deed that made her feel like a criminal. But she told herself the same mantra she always did: it's not my choice. I don't want to do it. That day, in English class, Miss Hamilton noticed how pale and jumpy Katie was. "Katie, are you feeling all right?" she asked softly when Katie came up to hand in an assignment. "I'm fine," Katie muttered, gaze darting to the floor. Miss Hamilton caught a glimpse of shame flickering across the girl's features, and her concern grew sharper. She wondered if something had happened at home. Maybe Martin and Rebecca had fought with Katie. Perhaps she was being neglected. That alone would be bad enough, but Miss Hamilton had no inkling of the criminal dimension unfolding in the shadows. In the days that followed, small rumors started drifting among students. "I saw Katie near the office real early," one boy whispered to a friend. Another student mentioned something about Katie rummaging in teachers' desks. Miss Hamilton heard these whispers and confronted Katie, but Katie denied everything. "That wasn't me," she insisted, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her fear. The teacher wasn't sure how to proceed without proof. If she accused Katie directly, the girl might shut down entirely or face worse at home. Ms. Hamilton realized she needed help. She approached Mrs. Anderson again, describing the rumors. "I'm really starting to suspect Katie's being coerced into something," Miss Hamilton said. "But I can't pin down what. Do you think we should contact social services?" Mrs. Anderson pursed her lips, considering. Without concrete evidence of abuse or wrongdoing, they might not intervene. "Let's keep observing, try to talk to Katie more. If we can get a direct statement or something incriminating, we'll have grounds." Miss Hamilton's frustration mounted. "We're running out of time. I can see it in her eyes, she's trapped." Unknown to them, Katie felt her own desperation rising. Martin and Rebecca were pushing bigger schemes. While Katie did her best to compartmentalize it all, school life on one side, forced errands on the other, she found it harder each day. She often stared at Miss Hamilton during class, tears burning in her eyes, wishing she could whisper, "Help me." Yet she never spoke those words aloud. A break in the case came unexpectedly. One late afternoon, Miss Hamilton was grading essays alone in her classroom when she saw Katie slip down the hallway toward the administrative wing. Curious and worried, Miss Hamilton quietly followed. She peered around a corner, her heart pounding at the sight of Katie crouched by a locked door, one leading to a storage room for sensitive records. She watched, horrified, as Katie skillfully picked the lock and darted inside. Miss Hamilton's first instinct was to call out, but she stifled herself. If she confronted Katie, the girl might panic or bolt. Instead, Miss Hamilton crept forward, pressing her ear to the door. She heard rustling inside, the sound of papers being moved. After a few nerve-wracking moments, Katie emerged with a small folder clutched under her arm. Miss Hamilton ducked back, hiding behind the corner so Katie wouldn't see her. The teacher's mind reeled. Katie was definitely up to something illegal. What? Miss Hamilton waited until Katie disappeared, then slipped into the storage room herself. She found an open drawer, documents scattered. She carefully picked one up, a staff payroll log. Another drawer had student files. Miss Hamilton's blood ran cold. This was no simple curiosity. Katie was retrieving something for a bigger purpose. Ms. Hamilton gingerly locked the cabinet, stepped back into the hallway, and found it empty. Katie was gone. Trying to keep calm, Ms. Hamilton returned to her classroom, 1,000 thoughts swirling. Had Martin and Rebecca forced Katie to do this? She recalled the boy who had spotted Katie near the office, the rumors about rummaging in desks. It all clicked. Katie was being coerced into petty theft or information gathering. Miss Hamilton's worry deepened into something akin to dread. If the Reynolds were involved in criminal activities, Katie was in far more danger than she'd realized. That evening, Miss Hamilton called Mrs. Anderson at home, breathless. "I saw her do it," Miss Hamilton said. "She broke into a storage room and took some files. She must be under someone else's instructions." Mrs. Anderson's tone was grim. "That changes everything. We need to take this to the principal, maybe the authorities. Katie's not just skipping lunch, she's committing crimes. And if it's forced, it's abuse, plain and simple." But Miss Hamilton was torn. "We can't just turn her in. She's still a child, a victim. If I report her to the principal, he might suspend her or call the police. We have to protect her." "I understand," Mrs. Anderson said gently. "But if we don't act, this could escalate. Her foster parents might keep using her for worse things. Let me think about how we can approach the principal without putting Katie in immediate jeopardy." They planned to meet the next morning. Miss Hamilton spent a restless night, half afraid Katie would vanish before they could help her. Meanwhile, at the Reynolds house, Katie paced in her room, clutching the folder she'd stolen. Martin had praised her coldly, instructing her to copy some of the information into a worn notebook he provided, then deliver the folder to a post office box across town the next day. "And if you fail," Martin had said, voice sharp, "the consequences will be on your shoulders." Katie's tears fell onto the pages, blurring some of the ink. She hated this. She wanted out. But the threats loomed like storm clouds. She could picture Miss Hamilton's concerned face, and for a split second, she thought about confiding everything. Then the memory of Martin's furious glare froze the confession in her throat. At school the next day, Miss Hamilton and Mrs. Anderson requested a private meeting with Principal Lawson. He was an older man, seasoned, known for running the school with a firm but fair hand. Still, he was sometimes slow to suspect wrongdoing if the parties involved wore a mask of respectability. Miss Hamilton laid out her observations: Katie's suspicious behavior, the rumored break-ins, the forced secrecy. She didn't say how she'd personally witnessed Katie pick the lock, not wanting to outright betray the girl. She pleaded that an investigation be done quietly. Principal Lawson listened, brow furrowed. "This is serious," he said, looking from Miss Hamilton to Mrs. Anderson. "Do you have any evidence that Katie is being coerced? Perhaps she's just acting out." Mrs. Anderson's eyes flashed with urgency. "We believe it's deeper than that. Katie's in foster care, and her behavior suggests manipulation or threats. Ms. Hamilton's instincts are rarely wrong about troubled students. Besides, we can't accuse her foster parents of criminal activity without proof. But I'll keep an eye on the situation. If we catch Katie in the act, we'll involve social services and possibly the police. Ms. Hamilton's stomach churned. I understand, she said, though the idea of Katie getting caught and punished felt like a betrayal of the child. But please, proceed with caution. After the meeting, Ms. Hamilton felt little relief. The official wheels of the system had started turning, but she worried they would grind too slowly. Meanwhile, Katie's predicament was immediate. The teacher decided on a new strategy. She would try to approach Katie directly once more, this time making it clear she knew about the break-ins. If Katie realized Ms. Hamilton was on her side, she might open up, or at least accept help. That afternoon, Ms. Hamilton spotted Katie heading toward the side door once again, presumably to fulfill another task. Ms. Hamilton hurried after her. Katie, she called. Katie froze, turning around with wide, fearful eyes. She clutched her backpack as if it were a life raft. Yes, Miss Hamilton? Miss Hamilton lowered her voice. I need to talk to you. Privately. Let's step into my classroom. Katie bit her lip, glancing down the hallway. She seemed torn, but nodded reluctantly. Once inside the empty classroom, Miss Hamilton closed the door and turned to Katie, struggling with how to begin. Katie, she said gently, I know you've been going places you shouldn't, taking things that aren't yours. I saw you near the storage room. I saw you take that file. Katie paled, her breath hitching. I don't know what you're talking about, she whispered, voice trembling. Ms. Hamilton's expression was kind but firm. I'm not here to punish you or judge you. I just want to help. If someone is making you do these things, please tell me. I promise I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. Tears welled in Katie's eyes, and for a split second, Ms. Hamilton thought she might finally break down and confess. But then Katie shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. No one's making me do anything, she lied, her voice wobbling. I'm just messing around. I'll stop. Ms. Hamilton wanted to reach out and hug the girl. Katie, I can see you're afraid. You don't have to lie. Whatever trouble you're in, I can help you. Mrs. Anderson can help you. We can find you a safe place. Katie's shoulders shook with silent sobs, but she pressed her lips together, refusing to speak another word. She backed toward the door, panic in her eyes. Please, she choked out, just leave me alone. Miss Hamilton felt tears prick her own eyes as she watched Katie flee. The teacher stood there, helpless, frustration and pity swirling in her chest. She knew the confrontation might not yield immediate results, but it still hurt to see Katie so terrified. Days passed, and the tension at Maplewood Middle School rose. Rumors about Katie continued to swirl. Principal Lawson discreetly informed the faculty to keep an eye out for any unusual activity. Ms. Hamilton could sense the net tightening. Inevitably, Katie would be caught. But she also knew that if Katie were caught in the wrong way, without a chance to explain, the girl could end up taking the blame alone, while the true culprits, Martin and Rebecca, remained unexposed. Despite the mounting dread, Miss Hamilton kept searching for a path to truth. She confided further in Mrs. Anderson, who suggested they might talk to people in Katie's neighborhood for clues. That's how Miss Hamilton ended up on the porch of Mrs. Edwards, a kindly older woman who lived 2 houses down from the Reynolds. Hello, Miss Hamilton said politely, introducing herself as Katie's teacher. I was hoping you might have a moment to talk about the Reynolds family. Mrs. Edwards frowned, stepping aside to let Miss Hamilton Indiana. The living room was neat, doilies on the furniture, a faint smell of lavender in the air. I've known Martin and Rebecca for a couple of years, Mrs. Edwards said. They always seemed polite, but lately, I don't know. Strange people come around late at night. I see car headlights pulling in and out. Once, I swear I heard a shout and then a door slam. Ms. Hamilton's pulse quickened. Have you noticed anything specifically involving Katie? Mrs. Edwards hesitated, her expression troubled. Well, I've seen her leaving the house at odd hours with Martin, like midnight sometimes. They seem to be carrying bags or boxes. She's just a child, you know. It didn't feel right. The teacher leaned forward, her voice urgent. Did you ever think about calling the police? I considered it, Mrs. Edwards admitted, sighing. But I don't like to pry. Besides, I have no real proof of wrongdoing, just suspicions. Ms. Hamilton nodded, forcing a reassuring smile. I understand. But Katie might be in danger. If you see or hear anything more, could you let me know? Or let the authorities know? Mrs. Edwards looked down at her hands. Yes, of course. I never realized it could be so serious. On the drive home, Miss Hamilton felt a surge of validation. At least one neighbor had glimpsed a side of Martin and Rebecca that didn't match their outward veneer of respectability. She told Mrs. Anderson about this, who agreed it was a step closer to building a case, but they still needed something more concrete, especially if Katie refused to speak. Meanwhile, the Reynolds began to suspect that the school was onto them. Martin noticed how Principal Lawson eyed him during a recent visit. Rebecca picked up on the hushed tension in Katie's demeanor, the way the girl seemed both anxious and defiant. They decided it was time to escalate their plans before the net closed in. One evening, Martin gathered Katie in the living room while Rebecca stood by with her arms folded. We need you to do one last job, Martin said, voice cool. We're moving forward with an important transaction, and we need certain documents from the district office. Not the school, bigger than that. Katie's gut twisted in fear. The district office? That's heavily guarded. I can't just pick locks there. Rebecca's eyes flashed. Don't talk back. You'll do whatever you must. We've taught you enough to get this done. You'll be accompanied by someone we trust. He'll drive you there, wait for you, and bring you home. You just need to slip inside and grab the folder we specify. Katie trembled, tears in her eyes. Why me? Why not do it yourselves? Martin's gaze turned icy. Because a 12-year-old raises less suspicion than a grown man or woman. We've gone over this. You're innocent-looking, and if security catches you, they'll assume it's a child's prank. Now, enough questions. Katie closed her eyes, feeling nauseated. This is wrong, she whispered. Rebecca's slap was sudden, cracking against Katie's cheek. Don't you dare get righteous with us, she hissed. We took you in. We gave you everything. You owe us. Tears stung Katie's eyes. She cradled her stinging cheek, hatred and despair surging inside her. Okay, she murmured, voice trembling. I'll do it. Good, Martin said, as if nothing violent had happened. It'll be tomorrow night. Make sure you have everything you need, your lockpick set, gloves. Don't get caught, Katie. Because if you do, we can't protect you. Katie nodded miserably. They never protected her anyway, not really. They only used her. That night, she lay awake, the bruise on her cheek throbbing. She thought of Miss Hamilton's concerned face, how the teacher had said, I promise I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. For a moment, Katie nearly picked up her phone to call Miss Hamilton, but she feared Martin and Rebecca more. She knew they were capable of cruelty far worse than a slap. The next day at school, Miss Hamilton noticed the faint bruise coloring Katie's cheek. Alarmed, she pulled the girl aside. Katie, she said, voice hushed, what happened? Did you hurt yourself? Katie stared at the floor. I fell. Miss Hamilton's heart pounded. Does this have anything to do with your foster parents? Katie shook her head quickly, but the teacher saw tears brimming. No, Katie whispered. Just leave it. Miss Hamilton felt heartbreak and fury swirling in her chest. She decided to contact social services immediately after school, even without Katie's direct confession. Enough was enough. She told Mrs. Anderson as much, and the counselor agreed to support her. That afternoon, Miss Hamilton made the call, detailing her observations, the bruise, the suspicious tasks, the neighbor's testimony, and her certainty that Katie was being coerced. The social worker on the line listened carefully, but hedged. "We'll open an investigation, ma'am, but it might take time. Can you keep the child safe in the meantime?" Miss Hamilton felt frustration building. "I'm doing my best, but I can't watch her 24/7. "We understand," the social worker said, voice polite but non-committal. "We'll do what we can." That night, Katie didn't go home after school. Instead, she was whisked away by a man Martin had described. They drove to the district office under cover of darkness. Her heart hammered in her chest as she slipped out of the car, lockpick in hand, aware of how terrifyingly real this was. She was about to break into a government building, crossing a line from petty theft into serious crime. She remembered every threatening word Martin and Rebecca had hurled at her. Her legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to creep toward the side entrance, scanning for security cameras. The area was quiet, only a few lights on. With trembling fingers, she inserted the pick into the lock. It opened more easily than she expected. She slipped inside, each footstep echoing in the silent hallway. She'd been given a small flashlight. She shone it along the walls, looking for the records room Martin had described. Her entire body shook. She wanted to run, to scream for help. But she pictured Martin's cold eyes, the sting of Rebecca's slap, and fear guided her forward. She found the door, picked the lock, and hurried in. According to Martin's instructions, she needed a specific file labeled with a red tab. The shelves were packed with documents. She rummaged through them, tears dripping from her chin. She cursed herself for not running away, for not telling Miss Hamilton everything. Finally, she found a folder with a bright red tab. Inside, various forms, sealed envelopes, official stamps. She stuffed it into her backpack, heart beating so loudly she feared it might draw security. She turned to leave, then froze at the sound of footsteps approaching. Adrenaline surged. She darted behind a cabinet, holding her breath. The footsteps paused outside the door. Light glowed beneath the gap. Katie felt her lungs tighten, her mind screaming at her to stay silent. The door rattled, but thankfully she had locked it from the inside. After a tense moment, the footsteps receded. Maybe a guard on patrol, she guessed. She waited, heart hammering, until she was sure they were gone, then unbolted the door and slipped out. Racing down the corridor, she retraced her path and fled the building. The man in the car gave her a curt nod when she handed over the folder. "Good job," he muttered, driving her off into the night. By the time Katie returned to the Reynolds house, she felt physically ill. Martin took the folder, rifled through it with satisfaction. "All here," he said. "Nice work, Katie. Now go to bed." Katie trudged upstairs, tears burning. She sank onto the edge of her bed, despising herself and her life. She was a criminal now, in deeper than ever. She prayed Miss Hamilton would somehow find out and rescue her. The next day, Miss Hamilton noticed Katie looked paler than usual, with dark rings under her eyes. The teacher cornered her once again, but Katie refused to speak. Miss Hamilton's frustration peaked. She could sense some cataclysmic event was around the corner. Social services hadn't yet intervened, and the principal was still in wait-and-see mode. Meanwhile, Katie was floundering under the weight of her forced crimes. That afternoon, while grading papers, Miss Hamilton's phone buzzed. She answered to find Mrs. Edwards on the line, voice trembling. "I'm so sorry to bother you at school, Miss Hamilton, but something's going on at the Reynolds house. Strange cars keep pulling up. I heard shouting." Miss Hamilton's chest tightened. "Mrs. Edwards, if you think Katie's in immediate danger, call the police." Mrs. Edwards hesitated. Maybe it's not that serious. But I'm worried. Katie didn't come home with them after school. Martin and Rebecca drove off again, and they seemed furious. Miss Hamilton swallowed hard. "Thank you for letting me know. I'll do what I can." She relayed the information to Mrs. Anderson, who looked equally concerned. "We should at least inform the principal," Mrs. Anderson said. "He might have resources or connections we don't." Principal Lawson listened gravely but insisted they needed tangible proof. Miss Hamilton felt her patience snap. Children's welfare is at stake, she pressed. Even if we're wrong, the risk is too high. Seeing her distress, the principal agreed to contact local law enforcement to request a wellness check on Katie, citing concerns about possible emotional abuse. Ms. Hamilton breathed a small sigh of relief. At least someone official would step in. That evening, an officer knocked on the Reynolds door. Martin greeted him with feigned politeness, claiming Katie was asleep upstairs. The officer asked to see her, and Martin smoothly escorted him to Katie's room, where the girl lay stiffly under the covers, eyes wide with terror. Rebecca stood behind the officer, a tight smile on her face. "Katie's had a rough day," Martin said. "She's been sick. We're taking good care of her." Katie nodded mutely, not daring to contradict him. The officer asked a few cursory questions, but Katie, petrified and exhausted, gave only one-word answers. Satisfied that there was no visible sign of abuse or bruises, and hearing no direct cry for help, the officer left. Martin gave Katie a triumphant smirk afterward. "See," he said. "You keep quiet, everything goes smoothly." Katie felt tears run down her cheeks. She had missed her chance, too scared to speak up, and the officer hadn't pressed. She felt more trapped than ever, certain no one could save her now. At school the next day, Miss Hamilton waited anxiously for news from the police or social services, but none came. She found Katie in the hall between classes and whispered, "Katie, I heard the police came by. Why didn't you tell them what's really happening?" The girl's eyes brimmed with tears. "They were right there," Miss Hamilton pleaded. "They could have helped you." Katie glanced around, paranoid. "I can't talk about it," she hissed, voice shaking. "They'll hurt me if I do." Miss Hamilton's heart lurched. She lightly touched Katie's arm. "They won't, Katie. Not if we intervene properly. We can protect you." Tears leaked down Katie's cheeks. She pulled away and fled again, disappearing into the crowd of students. Miss Hamilton stood there, eyes stinging with frustration and heartbreak, wanting to scream at the injustice of it all. Meanwhile, Martin and Rebecca ramped up their activities. The document Katie had stolen from the district office proved pivotal for some elaborate fraud scheme they'd been orchestrating. Money changed hands, illicit deals were made. Katie watched from the sidelines, forced to help in small but crucial ways, signing her name on forged forms, delivering packages to shady addresses. She was an unwitting accomplice, chained by terror. Mrs. Edwards mustered the courage to confront Martin one afternoon, asking why Katie never seemed to play outside or have friends over. Martin's face darkened. "Mind your own business," he snapped, slamming the door in her face. Rattled, Mrs. Edwards called Miss Hamilton again, voice quavering, "I'm sure something terrible is happening there." Miss Hamilton, for her part, redoubled her efforts with the authorities. She phoned Child Protective Services repeatedly, urging them to expedite their investigation. She shared Mrs. Edwards' testimony, the rumors at school, even her own witness account of Katie's break-in. At last, an investigator named Ms. Caldwell promised to conduct a thorough inquiry. "I'll do an unannounced visit soon," Ms. Caldwell said. "We'll check the premises, speak with Katie privately if possible." Ms. Hamilton breathed a small sigh of relief. Something might finally happen. But the wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly. Days passed. Martin and Rebecca, sensing the net closing, planned an escape. They told Katie to start packing her things. "We might move soon," Martin said cryptically. Katie's heart pounded with dread. But would they drag her somewhere far away, beyond Miss Hamilton's reach? She felt desperation balloon inside her. The night before the rumored move, she gathered her courage and sneaked a phone call to Miss Hamilton. A whispered, frantic confession. "Miss Hamilton," she said, voice trembling, "they're taking me away. I don't know where. Please help me." Miss Hamilton bolted upright in her living room. "Katie, listen to me. Where are you now?" "At home," Katie whimpered. "They're in the next room." I think they're planning to leave tomorrow or the day after. Stay put, Miss Hamilton urged, heart racing. We'll call the police right now. Do you have proof that they're forcing you to do illegal things? Katie swallowed. I have some documents. I snuck them out of Martin's office. But if they catch me, she couldn't finish. Fear closed her throat. Ms. Hamilton's voice was fierce with urgency. Katie, you have to trust me. Hide those documents, keep them safe. I'll call Ms. Caldwell, the social worker, and the police. We'll stop them. Just hold on, okay? Katie nodded, tears spilling. Okay, she whispered. Please, hurry. She ended the call, hugging the phone to her chest, feeling a faint spark of hope for the first time in months. Ms. Hamilton immediately phoned Ms. Caldwell, who promised to expedite a police escort and an emergency removal order for Katie if they could confirm the risk. The teacher then called the local precinct, relaying the urgent situation. They're planning to flee with a child who might be in danger, she insisted. The officer took note, said they'd coordinate with Child Protective Services. Ms. Hamilton prayed it would be enough. That night, Katie barely slept. She stuffed the incriminating documents into her school backpack, hoping to smuggle them out in the morning. But when dawn broke, Martin and Rebecca told her she wasn't going to school anymore. They were leaving by afternoon. Panic gripped her. She realized she might never see Ms. Hamilton again. As soon as Martin left the room, Katie dashed to the bathroom and texted Ms. Hamilton using the phone she'd hidden under the sink. They say we're leaving soon. I can't go to school. They're packing the car. She pressed send, heart hammering. Ms. Hamilton read the text with dawning horror. She immediately called Ms. Caldwell and the police again, urging them to act fast. We have to intercept them before they drive off with Katie. A tense hour passed, Ms. Hamilton pacing her living room, phone clutched in her hand, adrenaline surging through her veins. Then Ms. Caldwell called back, breathless. We're on our way to the Reynolds house with the police. Stay by your phone. At the Reynolds home, chaos reigned. Martin loaded boxes into the trunk. Rebecca barked orders, telling Katie to bring her belongings. Katie stalled, trembling, hoping the authorities would arrive in time. Finally, Martin snapped, We're leaving now. Get in the car. Katie, tears gathering, climbed into the back seat. Rebecca slid into the passenger side. Martin started the engine. Just as he began backing out of the driveway, sirens wailed down the street. Police cars screeched to a halt, lights flashing. Martin cursed, trying to accelerate, but an officer blocked his path, weapon drawn. Step out of the vehicle, the officer commanded. Rebecca shrieked, Katie, stay quiet. Martin reversed back into the driveway, slamming on the brakes as more officers surrounded them. Ms. Caldwell emerged from another car, clipboard in hand, her expression determined. Katie's heart hammered, tears streaming in relief and terror. The officers yanked Martin out, handcuffing him as he hurled curses. Rebecca was pulled from the car, too, screaming protests. Ms. Caldwell opened the back door, gently coaxing Katie out. It's okay, Ms. Caldwell said, voice calm. You're safe now. Katie collapsed into sobs, hugging Ms. Caldwell, all the tension of the last months pouring out. Neighbors gathered, watching in shock as the once-respected couple was led away in handcuffs. Mrs. Edwards stood on her porch, hand to her mouth, tears in her eyes. She locked eyes with Katie, nodding in reassurance. Meanwhile, Miss Hamilton, who had driven over as soon as she got the call, arrived just in time to see Katie wrapped in a blanket by the police car. She rushed over, heart in her throat. Katie, she exclaimed. Katie looked up, tears shining, and flung her arms around Miss Hamilton. You came, she sobbed. Miss Hamilton's eyes brimmed with her own tears. Of course I did, she whispered, holding Katie tightly. I promised I would. Off to the side, Martin and Rebecca glared in fury as the police read them their rights. They shouted denials, but the documents Katie had managed to smuggle, plus the forced break-ins, painted a damning picture. And once the authorities searched the Reynolds house, They found more evidence of widespread fraud and manipulation, implicating them in a larger criminal ring. After the immediate chaos subsided, Ms. Caldwell confirmed that Katie would be placed in emergency protective custody. But Ms. Hamilton spoke up, her voice trembling with emotion. "If it's at all possible, I'd like to foster her. I can't bear the thought of her going to another unknown place right now." Katie's eyes widened with hope. Ms. Caldwell looked at Ms. Hamilton thoughtfully. "We'll have to go through the proper process, but given the circumstances and your involvement in her rescue, I think it's a viable option." Katie clung to Ms. Hamilton's hand. "Please," she whispered. "I trust her." Ms. Hamilton felt tears threaten again. She squeezed Katie's hand. "We'll make it work," she promised, voice shaking. "You're not alone anymore." At that moment, a profound sense of relief and exhaustion washed over them both. Around them, police continued their work, neighbors murmured, and an ambulance arrived to check if Katie needed medical attention. She was physically fine, if still shaking from adrenaline. Ms. Hamilton refused to leave her side, riding with her to the station to fill out paperwork. It was the beginning of the end of Katie's nightmare. And yet, the fight wasn't entirely over. In the weeks that followed, social services, the police, and the school system unraveled the full scope of Martin and Rebecca's criminal web. They had used Katie for a range of illegal tasks, stealing documents, forging signatures, delivering contraband, exploiting her innocence. Ms. Hamilton testified before a family court that Katie had been coerced, threatened, and abused, emotionally and physically. Katie found it both painful and liberating to tell the truth at last. She described the break-ins at the school, the late-night deliveries, the falsified forms. She confessed to Ms. Hamilton with tears in her eyes, "I'm so sorry I lied to you." Ms. Hamilton stroked her hair gently. "You had no choice," she said. "Don't ever blame yourself for surviving." The court ruled in Katie's favor, officially removing her from the Reynolds custody. Since Ms. Hamilton had already begun the foster process, Katie moved in with her on a temporary basis. It felt surreal at first, waking up in Ms. Hamilton's small but cozy apartment, free from the constant fear that had haunted her for so long. She had a bed of her own, a warm comforter, and most importantly, the quiet assurance that Ms. Hamilton truly cared. Through all this, Ms. Anderson provided counseling to Katie. In the privacy of the counselor's office, Katie let out the pent-up guilt and trauma. "They made me do such awful things," she sobbed one day. "I felt like I was betraying the school, betraying you, betraying everyone. But I was scared. If I refused, they threatened me. They even hit me once. I couldn't see a way out." Mrs. Anderson listened, offering empathy and reassurance. "You were in an impossible situation," she said softly. "Survival was your only option. The blame lies with Martin and Rebecca, not you." In the following weeks, Ms. Hamilton helped Katie adjust to a new life. She enrolled her in therapy sessions outside school, replaced the meager clothing Katie had from the Reynolds house, and introduced her to a world where trust was genuine, not a manipulative tool. Katie struggled with nightmares at first, waking in a sweat, convinced Martin and Rebecca were coming for her. Miss Hamilton would rush in, comfort her, hold her until she calmed down. One night, Katie broke down, sobbing, "I'm so sorry, Miss Hamilton. I'm a criminal. You shouldn't have to take care of me." Miss Hamilton felt tears prick her own eyes. She wrapped Katie in a hug. "Katie, you're not a criminal. You were coerced. You're a child who needed help, and I'm glad I could be here for you. No more apologizing, okay?" Katie nodded, burying her face in Miss Hamilton's shoulder. Slowly, the nightmares began to recede. She found solace in day-to-day routines, waking up to Miss Hamilton's gentle call for breakfast, going to school without fear of returning to a dangerous home, actually focusing on classwork rather than carrying out criminal errands. Other students at Maplewood Middle School reacted with curiosity and gossip when they discovered that Miss Hamilton was now fostering Katie. Some whispered about the shocking revelations, that Katie had been forced into crime, that the Reynolds were criminals. A few classmates teased Katie, but most offered shy sympathy. Tasha, a fellow 7th grader, invited Katie to sit with her at lunch. "I'm glad you're safe now," she said softly. Katie managed a small smile in return. Principal Lawson, humbled by how events had unfolded, apologized to Ms. Hamilton for his earlier doubts. "You saw what no one else did," he admitted. "I'm grateful you persisted. We should have acted sooner." Ms. Hamilton accepted his apology graciously, relieved that Katie was finally out of harm's way. She worked with Mrs. Anderson to refine the school's policies on spotting and reporting signs of abuse or exploitation. "We can't let another child slip through the cracks like that," Ms. Hamilton said firmly. Meanwhile, Martin and Rebecca faced criminal charges ranging from fraud to child endangerment and abuse. The investigation revealed a broader network of illicit deals, though the Reynolds were just one part of it. Evidence from Katie's forced tasks provided key testimony. In a stark courtroom, Katie testified against them, voice trembling as she recounted the threats, the fear, and the manipulations. Martin glared at her with unmasked hatred, while Rebecca sneered. But neither could intimidate her anymore. After a tense trial, they were found guilty on multiple counts. The judge handed down a substantial prison sentence. When Katie heard the verdict, she burst into tears, not out of sadness for Martin and Rebecca, but from overwhelming relief that they no longer held any power over her life. The final quarter of this story was quieter, filled with the slow, painstaking process of healing and rebuilding. Katie learned to trust Ms. Hamilton's unconditional support. She no longer cringed whenever the phone rang, no longer jumped at every passing car. She immersed herself in school activities, joining an art club where she discovered a talent for sketching. Ms. Hamilton proudly hung Katie's drawings on the apartment walls. One afternoon, Katie came home from school to find Ms. Hamilton baking cookies, an altogether ordinary scene that made Katie smile. "How was class?" Ms. Hamilton asked. Katie set her backpack down. "Good. We're studying Greek myths. It's actually interesting." She paused, then added hesitantly, "I made some new friends in the art club. They know a bit about what happened. But they're being nice." Miss Hamilton's eyes shone with warmth. "That's wonderful. I'm so proud of you." Katie fiddled with a corner of her shirt. "I just feel, I don't know, guilty for everything that happened." Miss Hamilton moved closer, resting a hand on Katie's shoulder. "You're not at fault, Katie. Martin and Rebecca used you. You were a victim, but you're also a survivor. You're allowed to be happy now." Katie nodded, tears in her eyes, but a smile on her lips. "Thanks. I want to move on, you know? I want to stop feeling ashamed." Miss Hamilton squeezed her shoulder. "We'll work on that together." In time, the bond between them grew stronger. Katie began to see Miss Hamilton not just as a teacher but as a parent figure, someone who actually cared whether she ate breakfast, slept well, felt safe, and knew she was loved. They started talking about making the foster arrangement permanent, with Miss Hamilton adopting Katie. The idea excited and terrified Katie in equal measure. She had always yearned for a real family, but after her experiences with the Reynolds, trust came slowly. Nevertheless, Miss Hamilton pursued the legal steps. It was a lengthy process, but the social worker, Ms. Caldwell, advocated for them. "Katie deserves stability," Ms. Caldwell said at a hearing, "and Ms. Hamilton has proven her dedication." When the judge approved Ms. Hamilton's petition to formally adopt Katie, the tears they both shed in the courtroom were tears of joy. Katie felt a profound shift, no longer a foster child floating from place to place, but the daughter of someone who genuinely cherished her. Months passed, and the memory of Martin and Rebecca faded like a bad dream. Occasionally, Katie would wake in the night, heart pounding, but Miss Hamilton was always there to soothe her fears. "You're safe," Miss Hamilton would remind her gently, every single time. Eventually, Katie found herself looking forward to the future. She joined more school activities, started pulling her grades up, and even considered trying out for a sports team. She confessed to Ms. Anderson, "I feel like I have a life now." not just surviving day to day. Mrs. Anderson smiled. I'm so happy for you. You earned this, Katie. As the final echoes of the Reynolds trial died away, Katie allowed herself moments of reflection. She'd been through betrayal and terror, forced into crimes that haunted her memories. But she'd also found kindness, resilience, and a new family. The harshness of her past made the gentleness of her present all the sweeter. On a breezy spring day, Miss Hamilton and Katie celebrated their new life by visiting a local fair. Bright banners fluttered, the air smelled of cotton candy, and laughter rippled around them. Katie wore jeans and a pink sweater, her hair in a neat ponytail, smiling more freely than Miss Hamilton had ever seen. They played ring toss, ate soft pretzels, and strolled among the colorful stalls. At one point, Katie spotted a face-painting booth. She tugged Miss Hamilton's hand. "Can I get something painted?" she asked shyly. Miss Hamilton laughed, eyes crinkling. "Of course." Katie chose a small butterfly design on her cheek. The artist added sparkles that glimmered in the sunlight. When she looked at herself in the handheld mirror, Katie giggled, a sound that made Miss Hamilton's heart swell. They ended the day on a Ferris wheel, the big contraption creaking as it lifted them high above the fairgrounds. Katie gazed out at the horizon, wind ruffling her hair. She felt Miss Hamilton's arm around her shoulders. The world seemed vast and full of possibilities. For a moment, Katie closed her eyes, remembering the locked rooms she used to break into, the fear of footsteps behind every door, the threat of violence and the weight of secrecy. Then she breathed in the crisp air, opening her eyes to the bright sky. That life felt 1,000 miles away. Here, high above the bustling fair, she felt safe. Miss Hamilton squeezed her gently. "You okay?" Katie nodded, eyes glistening with emotion. "I'm better than okay." She hesitated, then added quietly, "I love you." Miss Hamilton's voice caught. "I love you too, Katie." They didn't need more words. The warmth of that mutual understanding wrapped around them like a shield against every past sorrow. The Ferris wheel slowed at the top, letting them linger with the wind in their faces, the carnival music drifting up from below. Katie's heart swelled with gratitude for the teacher who had become her champion, her guardian, her family. In the ensuing months, Katie continued healing. Therapy sessions addressed her lingering trauma, Miss Hamilton's unwavering support provided a stable home, and the school's staff watched her transform from a frightened shell into a bright, kind, and occasionally even mischievous 7th grader. She discovered she had a penchant for making witty remarks in class when she felt comfortable, which made Miss Hamilton grin from the front of the room. Sometimes, Miss Hamilton would catch Katie glancing around the classroom with a puzzled expression, as if she couldn't quite believe she was free. But each time, Miss Hamilton offered a small nod of encouragement. And each time, Katie's eyes softened with relief. The legal system eventually concluded the Reynolds case, sentencing Martin and Rebecca to significant prison terms for their role in organized fraud and child exploitation. It made headlines in the local newspaper for a while, but interest soon died down. Maplewood moved on, though the school's staff took note of the lessons learned, implementing stricter measures to protect vulnerable children. At year's end, Katie looked forward to summer. She and Miss Hamilton planned to visit a lakeside cabin for a short vacation, an idea that would have seemed impossible a year ago, when the concept of relaxation was foreign to Katie. She even dared to hope that life could be normal, maybe even good. One evening, as they lounged on the couch watching a silly sitcom, Katie turned to Miss Hamilton and said, "I've been thinking, maybe next year I could sign up for track. I like running." She shrugged, a shy smile tugging her lips. Miss Hamilton brightened. "That's a great idea. You've got long legs for it," she teased, earning a playful nudge from Katie. Katie's eyes danced. "Then I'll do it," she said. "Feels good to be part of something." Miss Hamilton ruffled her hair. "You'll be amazing." Their laughter blended with the gentle background noise of the TV. It was a quiet, domestic scene, so far removed from the sinister world of stolen documents and midnight errands that had once consumed Katie's existence. She realized, with a swell of warmth, that she was loved, secure, and free. As the school year wrapped up, Miss Hamilton received an outpouring of support from the community for her role in rescuing Katie. Other teachers admired her dedication. Parents expressed gratitude that she'd helped expose criminals in their midst. But Miss Hamilton never saw herself as a hero. She believed she'd simply done what any caring adult should do when a child needed help. The final day of school arrived with balloons in the hallway, yearbook signings, and the frenetic energy of a summer looming close. Katie walked with Miss Hamilton down the corridor, exchanging hugs and goodbyes with classmates. Tasha high-fived Katie, saying, "See you at the pool this summer, okay?" Katie nodded enthusiastically. "Definitely." By the time they left the building, the sun was high and bright. Miss Hamilton put an arm around Katie's shoulders. "So," she said, "ready for some rest and relaxation?" Katie glanced back at the school's front doors, her safe haven, ironically the same place she had once been forced to commit crimes. The building now represented salvation rather than fear. She smiled, leaning into Miss Hamilton's side. "Yeah, I'm ready." In the quiet months that followed, Katie found a new normal, a life that revolved around reading mystery novels, practicing for track, painting watercolors, and learning how to cook alongside Miss Hamilton. There were still moments where old memories jolted her, shadows in a dark hallway, a door locking behind her, but with therapy she learned coping strategies. She even found the strength to write a personal narrative in English class about overcoming adversity, though she never read it aloud to the other students. Eventually, the nightmares faded to a dull echo. Katie began to truly believe that Martin and Rebecca could no longer hurt her. She had the unwavering love of Miss Hamilton, a community that had rallied to her side, and the knowledge that she had survived something terrible and come out stronger. Sometimes, on quiet nights, Miss Hamilton would find Katie on the balcony, gazing at the stars. "Penny for your thoughts?" Miss Hamilton would ask gently. Katie would smile. "Just thinking how grateful I am." "What for?" "For you," Katie replied, voice soft. "For everyone who helped. For this life I have now." Miss Hamilton's eyes glistened. "I'm grateful too. You remind me every day why I became a teacher, to look out for kids like you, to make sure no one falls through the cracks." Katie slipped her hand into Miss Hamilton's. "Well, you did it. And now I'm thinking about my future. Maybe I'll be a social worker, or a counselor, or, I don't know, something that helps people." Miss Hamilton squeezed her hand. "You'd be wonderful at that." They stood there in companionable silence, the city lights flickering below, the stars twinkling above. Katie inhaled the cool night air, feeling the steady warmth of Miss Hamilton by her side. She couldn't change the past, those dark months of coercion and fear, but she could embrace the future with an open heart. Though echoes of the system's imperfections lingered, though Katie sometimes caught herself worrying about children who might still be trapped like she once was, she found solace in the fact that her own voice had finally been heard. She had spoken out, and it had saved her life. And so, in the final stretch of this tale, Katie carried on with hope. She laughed more easily, formed deeper friendships, and thrived in a stable home. Miss Hamilton's apartment was modest, but to Katie it was a palace of safety. The scars remained but grew fainter with each passing day. And if there was a single lesson Katie took from her ordeal, it was that silence could be deadly but speaking out could set you free. On the anniversary of her adoption, Miss Hamilton surprised Katie with a small celebration, a cupcake with a candle, and a photo album Miss Hamilton had made, documenting Katie's first year in her home. Katie flipped through the pages, tears in her eyes, seeing pictures of them at the fair, painting in the living room, or just goofing off in the kitchen. The final page read, "Here's to many more memories together." "Thank you," Katie whispered, looking up at Miss Hamilton. "For everything." Miss Hamilton pressed a gentle kiss to Katie's forehead. "I love you, Katie." Katie smiled. "I love you too, Mom." They shared the cupcake, giggling when the frosting smeared, and for the first time in Katie's memory, the future felt like a bright, open horizon instead of a trap. The relentless fight for justice had ended. The betrayal and exploitation were behind her. What lay ahead was a life molded by resilience, buoyed by the knowledge that the truth, once brought to light, could indeed save souls from the darkest corners of deceit. Katie carried that truth in her heart, determined to pay it forward one day. And for now, she savored each step into the gentle realm of safety and normalcy she had long been denied. Ultimately, her story stood as a testament to the power of speaking out, the vital importance of vigilant kindness, and the transformative grace of finding a real home after so much fear. When she curled up to sleep that night, the last thought fluttering through her mind was a simple, grateful prayer: "I'm free." And that, for her, was more precious than any stolen document or forged signature could ever be. It was proof that light could pierce even the darkest labyrinth, as long as just one person cared enough to shine it.